For 30 years, they were the ghosts of the American justice system. Men locked in concrete boxes for 23 hours a day, forbidden from seeing a blade of grass, a bird, or even another human face. They were told they were being buried alive to break the gangs. But in the silence, the ghosts didn't die. They evolved. Today, the windowless cells of the SHU are empty, but the war has simply moved to the sunlight. Welcome to the era of the ghost leaders, where the most dangerous men in California no longer rule through violence, but through a psychological chess match called the Inmate Council. And this time, they aren't just running the prison. They're running the system.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
Before we talk about power, we need to talk about silence. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet room. Not the peaceful silence you feel on a Sunday morning. We are talking about a silence so total, so absolute, so crushing, that the men who lived inside it began to hear their own thoughts like voices bouncing off the walls of an empty cathedral. This is the silence of the Security Housing Unit, the SHU. And to understand the ghost leaders of Pelican Bay, to truly understand what they became, and why the entire California prison system is only now beginning to realize what it accidentally created, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the concrete. Pelican Bay State Prison sits in the far northwestern corner of California, in a place called Crescent City. It is surrounded by ancient redwood forests, and the nearest major city is hours away. It was not built near a city by accident. It was built far from everything, deliberately, because the men it was designed to hold were not meant to be seen, heard, or remembered. When Pelican Bay opened in 1989, it was described by California officials as the most secure prison ever built in the United States. It was a statement. A message. The state of California was saying, clearly and loudly, that it had found the answer to its most dangerous problem. The powerful prison gang leaders who were running violence both inside and outside the walls. Men connected to organizations like the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood. Men who could order a murder from inside a cell and have it carried out on a street 300 miles away. The answer California came up with was simple, brutal, and, as we now know, deeply flawed. The answer was this: take the leaders, strip them of everything, lock them in a concrete box, and leave them there. Not for months. Not for a few years. Indefinitely. For as long as it took. Until they either gave up their gang membership, gave up their associates, or simply gave up entirely. That place, that concrete box, was the SHU. Let's talk about what the SHU actually was, because the word solitary confinement does not fully capture it. A standard SHU cell at Pelican Bay was 7 feet wide and 10 feet long. For context, that is roughly the size of a large bathroom. Inside that space lived one man. He had a concrete bunk with a thin mattress. A stainless steel toilet and sink combined into one unit. A small concrete shelf. A fluorescent light behind a steel grate that stayed on 24 hours a day. And a solid concrete wall where a window should have been. There was no window. No view of the sky. No blade of grass. No birds. No seasons. No way of knowing, without being told, whether it was morning or night, summer or winter. The door to that cell opened for approximately 1 hour each day. During that hour, the inmate was moved, alone, to a small concrete exercise pen. It was described by inmates as a dog run. It had a small opening at the top covered in wire mesh, through which the inmate could see a rectangle of sky. For most men, that was the only sky they saw all day. One rectangle. Maybe one cloud. Maybe nothing. After that 1 hour, the door closed again. And the silence returned. Now here is the question that the architects of this system never fully asked. And it is the most important question in this entire story. What happens to a human mind when you remove everything from it? When there is no conversation, no movement, no human contact, no visual stimulation, no change, what does the brain do? The psychologists who have studied solitary confinement extensively have documented what they call SHU syndrome. The symptoms are severe. Inmates begin to experience intense anxiety, hypersensitivity to sound and light, perceptual distortions, seeing things move that are not moving, paranoia so deep it becomes a permanent feature of the personality, depression so heavy it feels physical, like concrete on the chest. Many men broke. That is the honest truth. Many men lost their minds, in the most literal sense of those words, inside the Pelican Bay SHU. But some men did not break. And that is where this story truly begins. The men who did not break, the men who would eventually become known as the ghost leaders, did something extraordinary. They turned inward. With no external world to engage with, they built an internal world of extraordinary complexity. Think about it like this. If you take away a person's television, their phone, their books, their conversations, their music, and every other form of stimulation, and you leave them in silence for 20 years, most people assume the person becomes less, smaller, diminished. And for many, that is exactly what happened. But for a specific type of person, a person with a certain kind of intelligence, a certain kind of discipline, and a certain kind of will, the opposite occurred. Without distraction, the mind sharpened to a point. Without noise, the ability to analyze silence became a superpower. Without other people to react to, the ability to read people, to understand what they want, what they fear, what they will do before they do it, became extraordinary. These men spent 10, 15, 20 years doing nothing but thinking. And they became very, very good at it. There is a concept in psychology called the second signal system. It refers to the part of human consciousness that processes language, symbols, and abstract thought, as opposed to the first signal system, which responds to direct, physical reality. A dog lives almost entirely in the first signal system. It responds to what it sees, smells, hears. A chess grandmaster lives deeply in the second signal system, processing the board not as physical pieces but as a complex web of possibilities, threats, and strategies several moves into the future. After 20 years in a SHU cell, the ghost leaders had effectively abandoned the first signal system. Physical reality, the concrete, the door, the routine, was irrelevant and unchanging. There was nothing to react to. So they lived entirely in the second signal system. In the world of language, strategy, symbols, and abstract power. They were not thinking like street criminals anymore. They were thinking like political strategists. They were thinking like people who understood that the most powerful force in any system is not violence. It is information. It is relationships. It is the ability to make other people believe that your interests and their interests are the same thing. This is what the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation did not understand. It thought it was breaking these men. It was, in fact, producing them. Let us now talk about something specific. Because this story is not just about psychology in the abstract. It is about what these men actually did with that psychology when the doors finally opened. In 2011, a hunger strike began at Pelican Bay that would eventually involve over 30,000 inmates across California's prison system. 30,000 people. Coordinated. Disciplined. Organized from inside the most isolated cells in the state. The men in the SHU, the men with no phones, no internet, no face-to-face meetings, organized the largest prison protest in California history using nothing but handwritten notes passed through attorneys and the prison mail system. The notes were called kites. Small, tightly folded pieces of paper carrying instructions, strategies, and messages. And the men writing those kites were doing it from inside 7x10 concrete boxes where they had not seen another human face in years. Think about that for one moment. These were men with no resources, no freedom, no technology. And they built a communication and coordination network so effective that it moved 30,000 people simultaneously. The California Department of Corrections did not break the gang structure by putting its leaders in solitary. It gave the gang leaders a 20-year graduate course in remote organizational management. And then it kept them enrolled for free. The hunger strike led, eventually, to a landmark legal battle. The case was called Ashker versus the Governor of California. Todd Ashker was an Aryan Brotherhood member who had spent decades in the Pelican Bay SHU. He filed a class action lawsuit arguing that indefinite solitary confinement constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the United States Constitution. In 2015, California settled. The settlement was extraordinary. Under its terms, the state agreed to end the practice of indeterminate SHU sentences, the indefinite, open-ended solitary confinement that had been the cornerstone of California's gang suppression strategy for 25 years. Going forward, inmates could only be sent to the SHU as a disciplinary measure for a specific rule violation, for a specific, defined period of time. The ghost leaders had won. Not with violence. With law. They had filed motions. They had built legal arguments. They had coordinated with civil rights attorneys. They had used the language of the Constitution and the federal court system as a weapon, and they had defeated the state of California in its own arena. If there was any remaining doubt that these men had evolved into something the system was not designed to handle, that doubt ended in 2015. But here is where the story becomes truly fascinating. And truly alarming. The settlement meant that over 500 men who had spent 10, 20, sometimes 30 years in total isolation were now being released into the general population of California's prisons. The GP, the regular prison yard, with its dormitories, its dining halls, its exercise yards, its social hierarchies, its noise and its chaos. For most people on the outside, the reaction to this news was simple. Good. Solitary confinement is inhumane. These men should be with other people. The psychological damage of isolation is real and documented. Ending it is the right thing to do. And that argument is entirely correct. Prolonged solitary confinement is psychological torture. The research is clear. The human rights organizations are clear. The courts, ultimately, agreed. But here is the other side of that coin. The side that the policy debate rarely discusses. The side that investigators, corrections officers, and gang intelligence analysts quietly talk about in private. These 500 men, after 20 years of doing nothing but thinking, were now walking into a population of tens of thousands of younger, less organized, less strategically sophisticated inmates. And they carried with them an authority that was not built on muscle. It was not built on violence or intimidation. It was built on something far more durable. It was built on reputation, on legend, on 20 years of silence that everyone in the prison world interpreted, correctly, as 20 years of absolute loyalty and absolute will. In the world of prison social structure, there is no greater currency than that. The younger inmates, many of them under 26, many of them part of decentralized street gangs like Tango Blast that had no rigid hierarchy, no long-term strategy, no organizational depth, looked at these men and saw something they did not have. They saw structure. They saw discipline. They saw men who had been tested at the absolute limit of human endurance and had not broken. In a world where strength is everything, these were the strongest men in the room. Not because they could fight. Because they had already survived something no one else could. The ghost leaders, for their part, looked at the younger generation and saw something too. They saw raw material. They saw energy without direction. They saw men who were making decisions based on impulse, on the moment, on the demands of digital culture, posting on social media, chasing fast money, operating in short-term bursts with no long-game thinking. They saw, in short, an army that did not know it needed a general. And so the mentorship began. Not openly. Not in a way that any policy document or incident report could easily capture. It began in the way that all real power transfers, through conversation. Through proximity. Through the slow, patient work of one mind shaping another. This is the moment in the story where we need to introduce the institution that made all of it possible. The legal structure that the ghost leaders identified, understood, and began to inhabit in a way its designers never anticipated. The Inmate Advisory Council. Under California Code of Regulations, Title 15, Section 3230, every California state prison is legally required to maintain an Inmate Advisory Council. The IAC is a body of elected inmate representatives whose official purpose is to communicate inmate concerns to prison administration, to advise the warden, to serve as a formal channel between the population and the institution. On paper, it is a reasonable, even progressive idea. Give inmates a voice. Reduce grievances. Improve communication. Prevent the kind of pressure cooker conditions that lead to riots and violence. In practice, in the post-Ashker era, with 500 ghost leaders integrated into the general population, the Inmate Advisory Council became something else entirely. It became the most sophisticated and legally protected organizational structure available to the men who had spent 20 years learning how to build organizations. The ghost leaders did not storm the IAC. They did not take it by force. They did not intimidate their way onto the council. They simply ran for election. They showed up. They listened to what other inmates needed. They presented themselves as men of experience, men of calm, men who understood how the system worked and could navigate it on behalf of the population. And the population, desperate for representation, tired of being ignored, looking for leadership, voted for them. It was, in every sense of the word, a democratic takeover. By 2024, reports from the California Office of the Inspector General, the independent body that monitors the state's prison system, were documenting a pattern that should have surprised no one who understood the history we have just walked through. The pattern was this: IAC concerns were beginning to mirror, with remarkable consistency, the operational needs of the prison gang structure. Requests for the transfer of specific correctional officers, officers who were known to be effective at contraband interdiction, were appearing in formally submitted IAC documents. Changes to visitation protocols that would have made contraband smuggling easier were being framed as family rights concerns. Scheduling changes that would have reduced supervision during key hours were presented as quality-of-life improvements. Every request was legal. Every request was submitted through the proper channel. Every request was framed in the language of rehabilitation, dignity, and the California model. And every request served the machine. This is the psychological warfare the title of this documentary refers to. Not guns. Not knives. Not threats. The warfare is happening in meeting rooms, on legal notepads, in the language of policy and regulation. The weapons are Robert's Rules of Order and Title 15 of the California Code of Regulations. The battlefield is a conference table with a CDCR official on one side and an Inmate Advisory Council representative on the other. And the ghost leaders, the men who spent 20 years in a concrete box learning to think 3 moves ahead, are winning. This is Act 1. This is the fracture. The place where the system cracked. Not with a bang, but with a slow, silent, inexorable pressure applied from the inside. In Act 2, we are going inside the machine itself. We are going to look at the California model, the $14 billion transformation of the prison system that the ghost leaders are now navigating from the inside. We are going to look at the tablet revolution, the new classroom spaces built inside former SHU wings, and the extraordinary question that no one in Sacramento seems to want to ask out loud. When you give the most strategically sophisticated inmates in California history access to encrypted digital communication, what exactly do you think is going to happen next? Stay with us. If a man spends 20 years in total silence and comes out thinking like a political strategist, is that a failure of the system, or is that exactly what the system created on purpose? Tell me what you think in the comments. There is a phrase that the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation uses now. A phrase that appears in official budget documents, in press releases, in the speeches of prison wardens and state legislators. The phrase is this: the California model. It sounds progressive. It sounds modern. It sounds like the language of change, of rehabilitation, of a system that has looked at its own failures and decided to do something different. And in many ways, it is all of those things. The California model represents a genuine, large-scale, and expensive attempt to transform one of the most troubled prison systems in the world into something more humane, more effective, and more just. But here is what the press releases do not say. Here is what the budget documents do not explain. The California model, with its $14 billion and its good intentions and its bachelor degree programs and its state-issued tablets, was built on top of a foundation that was already occupied. And the men who occupied that foundation had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this moment. To understand what the California model actually is, we need to understand what it was designed to replace. For most of its modern history, California's prison system operated on a philosophy that criminologists call isolation culture. The idea was simple. If a person is dangerous, separate them from others. If a group is dangerous, scatter its members. If a leader emerges, remove the leader and put them somewhere they cannot lead. This philosophy produced the SHU. It produced Pelican Bay. It produced 23 hours a day in a 7x10 concrete box, no windows, no human contact, no end date. And as Act 1 established, it produced something else entirely. It produced the ghost leaders. By 2019, California was facing a crisis that had been building for decades. Its prisons were massively overcrowded. A landmark Supreme Court ruling, Brown versus Plata, decided in 2011, had found that the overcrowding constituted cruel and unusual punishment, and had ordered the state to reduce its prison population. Civil rights lawsuits were piling up. Federal oversight was ongoing. The Ashker settlement had already dismantled the indefinite SHU system. And a growing body of research was making it increasingly difficult to defend isolation culture on either moral or practical grounds. The research was saying something very clear. Solitary confinement does not rehabilitate anyone. It does not reduce recidivism, which means the rate at which people who leave prison end up back inside it. In fact, the evidence suggested it made recidivism worse. Men who spent years in solitary came out more damaged, less equipped to function in society, and more likely to reoffend. The system designed to suppress the most dangerous people was, in many cases, producing more dangerous people and then releasing them. California needed a new model. And so it built one. The California model, as it was formally adopted and funded through the 2025 to 2026 state budget, is organized around a concept borrowed from Scandinavian prison systems, specifically Norway's approach, which criminologists point to as one of the most effective rehabilitation models in the world. The core idea is called normalization. Normalization means this: prison should resemble normal life as closely as possible. Inmates should have access to education, to meaningful work, to social interaction, to privacy, to dignity. The goal is not punishment for its own sake. The goal is to prepare people to return to society as functioning members of that society. You cannot teach someone to live in freedom by keeping them in a cage. This philosophy produced real, tangible changes inside California's Level 4 facilities, the highest security prisons, including Pelican Bay. Former SHU wings, the very concrete corridors where ghost leaders had spent decades in silence, were converted into what the CDCR calls resource team spaces. These are open, collaborative areas where inmates can access programming, counseling, and educational support. The sealed cell doors were removed. Light was let in. The architecture of isolation was, at least in part, physically dismantled. Bachelor degree programs were introduced inside Pelican Bay. Real, accredited university courses, leading to real degrees, offered to men serving long sentences. The research on prison education is unambiguous. Access to higher education dramatically reduces the likelihood that a person will return to prison. The programs are not charity. They are, by any objective measure, an effective investment. And then there was the tablet program. In late 2024 and through 2025, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation rolled out state-issued tablets to the inmate population at a scale that had never been attempted before. By the end of 2025, over 93,000 inmates across the California state prison system had access to a tablet device. The tablets were designed for education and communication. Inmates could use them to take online courses, to access legal resources, to communicate with family members through a monitored messaging system, to access approved entertainment. The CDCR framed the tablet program as a rehabilitation tool, a way of keeping inmates connected to the outside world, reducing the alienation and disconnection that makes successful reentry so difficult. And again, on the level of stated intention, none of that is wrong. Connection to family reduces recidivism. Access to education reduces recidivism. Reducing alienation and restoring a sense of human dignity reduces recidivism. The research supports all of it. But here is the question that the architects of the tablet program do not appear to have asked loudly enough. Or perhaps asked and answered in a way that made them comfortable but should not have. For 20 years, the most sophisticated organizational minds in the California prison system had been communicating through handwritten notes folded into small squares and passed through door slots and prison mail channels. That system, the kite system, was slow, vulnerable to interception, and physically limited. It required physical proximity. It required human couriers. It had choke points that prison intelligence officers knew how to identify and monitor. Now those same men had encrypted digital messaging. Now those same men had a device that connected, through a monitored but imperfectly monitored system, to the outside world. Now those same men had a tool that the CDCR itself had issued, legitimized, and placed in their hands. The dark era of information control, the era when prison gang communication was slow and fragile and interceptable, ended the moment the first tablet was handed to the first inmate at Pelican Bay. What replaced it was faster, more scalable, more durable, and significantly harder to track. The digital kite. And unlike the paper kite of 20 years ago, the digital kite did not require anyone to physically walk a piece of paper from one end of a corridor to another. Now let us talk about the Inmate Advisory Council in the context of the California model. Because this is where the two forces, the transformation of the system and the evolution of the ghost leaders, meet head-on. The California model requires the IAC to function. It is not optional. Under the normalization philosophy, inmate voice is not just tolerated, it is structurally necessary. The whole premise of the California model is that treating inmates as participants in the system, rather than objects of the system, produces better outcomes. The IAC is the formal mechanism through which that participation happens. So the California model, in its very design, elevated the importance of the Inmate Advisory Council. It gave the IAC more meetings, more access to administration, more formal weight. It created more channels through which IAC concerns could influence policy. It made the IAC, in short, more powerful. And who was sitting in the IAC seats? The men who had spent 20 years preparing to sit exactly there. Let us walk through what an IAC meeting actually looks like in the post-California model era. Because the procedure matters. The procedure is where the power is hidden. An IAC meeting takes place in a designated room inside the prison, a meeting room, not a cell block. IAC representatives, who are elected by their fellow inmates, sit across a table from prison administration. This typically includes the warden or a deputy warden, and representatives from various operational departments. The meeting is formal. It is minuted. There is an agenda. The IAC representatives raise concerns. They present them in the language of policy, referencing specific sections of Title 15, citing inmate rights, framing issues in terms of the California model's stated goals of rehabilitation and normalization. The administration responds. Some concerns are addressed. Some are tabled for review. Some are rejected. On the surface, it looks like exactly what it is supposed to look like. A formal dialogue between inmates and administration, conducted professionally, within the rules. But look at the specific concerns being raised, as documented in the Office of the Inspector General reports from 2024 and 2025, and a different picture emerges. Concern: transfer of Correctional Officer A from Housing Unit 3. Reason stated: Officer A's conduct has been creating tension among the inmate population, negatively affecting the rehabilitative environment. Translation: according to the OIG analysis, Officer A was the most effective contraband interdiction officer on that unit. His removal would open the unit to significantly increased smuggling activity. Concern: modification of visitation search protocols for family visitors. Reason stated: current protocols are invasive, humiliating to family members, and create a barrier to the family contact that the California model identifies as essential to successful rehabilitation. Translation: modified protocols would create a window through which contraband, specifically narcotics, could be introduced by visitors during contact visits. Concern: scheduling adjustment for yard time in the evening hours. Reason stated: current schedule does not adequately account for the programming needs of older inmates, particularly those over 60, who find the midday heat on the yard medically problematic. Translation: evening yard time would shift the primary exchange period for contraband and communication to a lower supervision window. Every concern is real. Every concern has a legitimate dimension that the administration must take seriously. The heat on the yard is genuinely a medical issue for older inmates. Family visits are genuinely important for rehabilitation. Officer conduct does genuinely affect the environment. That is precisely the point. The concerns are not fabricated. They are real issues, selected because they are real, weaponized because of their dual function. This is not crude manipulation. This is sophisticated, led, strategic thinking applied to the exploitation of a well-intentioned system. This is what 20 years of silence built. And now we need to talk about the 2012 agreement to end hostilities. Because without understanding this document, the full picture of what the ghost leaders are doing inside the IAC cannot be seen. In 2012, at the height of the Pelican Bay hunger strikes, something extraordinary happened. The leaders of California's major prison gangs, organizations that had been in violent conflict with each other for decades, issued a formal agreement. A peace treaty. The agreement to end hostilities stated that race-based violence between inmate groups should cease. That black, Latino, and white inmates should not be engaging in conflict based on racial affiliation. The agreement was widely reported as a humanitarian breakthrough. And in one sense, it was. Violent incidents in California prisons did decrease in the period following the agreement. Less violence is always, in the most basic sense, better than more violence. But here is what the agreement actually was, when viewed through the lens of strategic analysis rather than sentiment. The ghost leaders were running businesses. Black market businesses, narcotics, contraband, extortion, protection, that generated real money and real power inside the prison system. Violence was bad for business. A riot means a lockdown. A lockdown means no movement. No movement means no transactions. No transactions means no revenue. The agreement to end hostilities was not primarily a moral document. It was a business decision. It was the ghost leaders deciding, collectively, that the cost of violence, in lockdowns, in increased scrutiny, in disruption to operations, outweighed whatever territorial or status benefit the violence produced. By maintaining peace on the yard, the ghost leaders kept the system running smoothly. And a smoothly running system was a system in which their black market operations could function without interruption. The peace was real. And the peace was a weapon. This is the concept that corrections professionals call strategic peace, and it is one of the most difficult challenges facing modern prison administration. Because how do you respond to peace? How do you write a policy that treats reduced violence as a threat? How do you explain to a budget committee, a journalist, or a judge that the fact that nothing is happening on the yard is the problem? You cannot. Not easily. Not without sounding paranoid. And so the ghost leaders operate in a space that is almost perfectly protected. They suppress violence, which means administrators cannot justify increased security measures on the basis of violence statistics. They work through the IAC, which means their organizational activities happen in legally protected, formally sanctioned meetings. They use the California model's own language, rehabilitation, normalization, dignity, to frame their demands. They are, in the most precise sense of the phrase, hiding in plain sight. Now let us zoom out for a moment and look at the demographics, because the numbers tell a story that makes everything we have discussed more urgent. As of 2026, 32% of parole hearings in California are for inmates aged 60 and older. Think about that number. Nearly 1 in 3 parole decisions involve someone who is at least 60 years old. These are men who entered the system in the 1980s and 1990s, men who lived through the rise of the SHU, men who were shaped by 2 or 3 decades of institutional life. Many of them are the ghost leaders. And at the same time, on the other end of the age spectrum, the 2024 passage of Proposition 36 in California is doing something significant to the population those ghost leaders are now encountering. Proposition 36 increased penalties for certain drug and theft offenses, reversing some of the sentencing reforms of the previous decade. Early projections suggest it will increase California's prison population meaningfully over the next several years. In practical terms, Proposition 36 means more young people entering the California prison system. More people in their late teens and early 20s, many of them first-time serious offenders, many of them members of loosely organized street-level gangs like Tango Blast, decentralized, leaderless, operationally unsophisticated, and very far from the structured world the ghost leaders represent. From the ghost leaders' perspective, Proposition 36 is not a threat. It is a delivery mechanism. It is sending a fresh, unorganized, impressionable population directly into the yards that the ghost leaders now manage through the IAC. And under the California model's normalization philosophy, with its mentorship programs, its peer counseling initiatives, its restorative justice circles, there are now formal, institutionally sanctioned channels through which older experienced inmates are explicitly encouraged to mentor younger, newer inmates. The ghost leaders did not build that channel. The California model built it for them. This is the system inside the system. This is what $14 billion and the best intentions in the world have produced when led over a foundation that was already in place, already organized, already occupied by men who understood exactly what the system was offering them and exactly how to use it. The California model is not wrong. The research that supports it is real. The outcomes it aims for, reduced recidivism, safer prisons, more successful reentry, are genuinely valuable. The state of California is not the villain of this story. The story is more complicated and more uncomfortable than that. The story is about what happens when a well-designed system meets a more sophisticated adversary than its designers anticipated. What happens when the most psychologically sophisticated inmates in the history of California's prison system are handed the tools of normalization, and those tools fit, almost perfectly, into the organizational architecture those inmates already built in the dark. The California model gave the ghost leaders a classroom and called it rehabilitation. The ghost leaders sat down, opened the textbook, and started taking notes. In Act 3, we are going to look at the lasting impact of all of this. Not just on the prison system, not just on the inmates, but on the families, the communities, and the young men being funneled into this system right now, young men who are being mentored, reshaped, and quietly recruited into an organizational structure that existed before they were born and will exist long after they are gone. We are going to ask the hardest question this story contains. When the system designed to rehabilitate a person is the same system being used to re-recruit them into the gang structure they came from, who is responsible for what happens next? Stay with us. The California model spends $14 billion on rehabilitation. But if the men running the programs are the same men running the black market, is rehabilitation even possible inside a system this compromised? Tell me what you think in the comments. The concrete is empty. But the game never stopped. The ghost leaders didn't escape the system. They became it. And somewhere in California tonight, a cell door is open, and the chess match continues.